Hi there, welcome to another episode of OpenIntro. I'm your host Joel Blake, and it's my pleasure to be with you once again, giving you the opportunity to meet the unmeetables. Today's guest is someone who, in our previous conversation, was really passionate and really empowering in her journey, and I'm sure there's going to be some elements, some gems, some insights from our conversation today that can help you on your journey. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce the wonderful Ahana Banerjee. Ahana, how are you?
I'm good, thanks, Joel. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you very much indeed. As I say, I think there's going to be some great conversation today, and I'm really excited to learn more about your journey and helping the audience to learn a lot about what really drives you. And so I'd like just to maybe, if you want to just introduce yourself, and then maybe just start by answering a single question. Why do you do what you do?
Okay. So I can answer both. I'll give a quick intro to begin with. But I think really in the introduction of who I am, you will get the answer of why I do what I do. So my name is Ahana. I'm the founder and CEO of Clear, which is a Y Combinator backed beauty tech company. So we have a free app that helps people figure out which skincare products to use and whether they're actually working. It works very similar to a period tracker or a diet tracker. And I started the company having struggled with my own skin for many, many years. So that's a little bit about, what I do. And I think that the why is two-sided, and I touched on it a little bit there. I've suffered a lot with my own skin, and I always had trouble knowing which products to use, to know whether they were working, and it's such a heavily marketed industry that there's actually comparatively little data and science that goes into consumer decision making. And I come from a background having a physics degree and sort of having loved science through my whole life. And I'd always wondered, why is there so little data and science in this massive aspect of my life? But more, I don't know if philosophically is the right word for it, but I suppose we've all had our personal challenges. Not everyone goes on to found companies trying to solve them. And I do think that that's quite a big life decision to make. And I think for me, it really stems from my childhood. So I lived in the UK till I was 14 years old in Cheshire. Then at the age of 14, me and my family moved to New Delhi, India. And then at the age of 16, moved to Singapore. Now, I think it was in particular that transition to Delhi that had a huge impact on me, because it was my first time experiencing an international school, an international environment. And I think, this was the first time that I had seen kids my age whose parents were CEOs of companies, ambassadors to their countries. It was a level of privilege I had never quite seen before, especially having come from a state school in the UK. But on the flip side, India is a country of massive extremes. And while I was experiencing this life of privilege, like I had never seen before, I was also seeing poverty like I had never seen before. And I think there was an added layer for me, even though I was in an expat environment in my day-to-day and it was an international school, I am of Indian origin. I look like people that I was seeing suffering around me. And I always just wondered, what did I do to deserve this life? How am I the one going to this school? How do I have this great education in front of me? And I think from that point, it instilled a really deep sense of responsibility of, I have to do something with all these advantages I've been given. Not to say I'm the most privileged person in the world, but I think that transition made very clear to me that I had a great education. That was my biggest unfair advantage in life. I have a supportive, loving family, I have good health, and these are all things that one shouldn't take for granted. And who, if anyone, is going to try and solve the world's problems, if not somebody like me that has been given every advantage in life and, every opportunity to try. And so, at the time, I thought that the way I would have that impact and, change the world was through science, which is why I went on to study physics. I really believe that, to solve problems is to innovate. And as a scientist, you are kind of by definition doing that. Once I got to university, however, and the more I realized about a career in academia, the less I felt that it was the best aligned with my skill set, because although I love the technical side and, the science and the maths, I also love the people and, just psychology and understanding why people do things. And I didn't feel that I could necessarily get that through a career in academia. And so I then went on a journey of self-discovery, if you will, and what that looked like in practice was applying for any and every internship. So I did internships in software engineering, in investment banking. I was applying for hedge funds, consulting firms, literally every company that had an application, I probably applied. But what this did is it meant that in relatively few years, I gained quite an eclectic range of experiences in lots of different areas. And I started to build up a self-awareness of, what matters to me, what are my own personal values, but also what is the best way to have an impact given my skill set. And, after trying many, many things in my third year, I did my first startup job alongside my degree, and that was another big turning point where I discovered that as someone who likes to code but also likes business and people, the best way for me to help others is by starting a tech company. That's what plays to my advantages. And so, as I said, I've had a very personal journey with my skin. There's so many problems in the industry, but the sort of positive flip side to that is there's so much opportunity for innovation. And again, how many skincare enthusiasts are also software engineers? If not me, who else is going to build this company?
Well, actually, I wanted to pick up on that, if you don't mind me interrupting there, because there are challenges and there are challenges, right? There, as a female, ethnic minority background in the tech space, that's challenging in of itself. Yet you seem to still have this conviction of wanting to still utilize the opportunities that you had with those challenges to make a difference. And obviously the importance of that for you and for those who you support. But how did you find the actual first tentative steps going into the tech space, bringing in all that difference and making a difference?
Yeah, so it's not an easy space to break into, but I will say that especially on the point of being a young, brown, female person, when I first started, I didn't think about that at all, actually. And I think that's because to a large extent, my education had shielded me from having negative experiences. And, yes, I had done internships, but they were all primarily in larger companies, larger organizations, where there's entire armies of HR people to make sure that, at least for the new graduate recruits, things seem fairly okay and there's no outright discrimination. And I'm sure, of course it exists in large organizations too, but you're not sort of like in the Wild West, so to speak. There's a lot of checks and balances that make sure that people act a certain way. And so, I kind of just had this blind ambition and desire on a very personal note to just learn as much as I possibly could from every experience, which is why I threw myself into so many experiences. And so I mentioned that first startup job I did in my third year. That was kind of when I knew I wanted to build a company of my own. The challenge at that stage was that company that I was working in, I didn't see myself starting my career there. And that job had given me the confidence that I can build a product from scratch. I can get people to sign up to something and I can get people to pay for something. These three core things I believe I can do, which you need to start a company. The thing that I didn't do in that first startup job was raise capital, because it was a family funded business. And that was just something that I knew nothing about. And I also knew that to start a tech company, to put it very crudely, who's going to pay rent while I'm writing the code? You need some upfront capital. And at that point as a student, I didn't have the financial freedom to do that. And I was in a position where I couldn't be financially dependent on anyone else when I finished university. And so I almost wrote off the idea of starting a company in my early 20s at that point, because it just didn't seem realistic. I know nothing about investors, venture capital, I can't even get a meeting with an investor. So, even though I have the skills to build a company and I feel ready, the thing I don't have is money. And my solution to acquiring money is I have these high-paying graduate job offers. So my plan was to take my graduate jobs in finance, work for a few years, save up, and use that to start my degree. My degree, what am I saying? My company. And so that was the plan, to finish my degree, take the job, work, save up, start a bit later. All of that changed during COVID. That coincided with the final year of my physics degree. So all of a sudden I had a bit more free time. I'd already secured 2 really good graduate job offers for after I was going to graduate, so I didn't have the added stress and time sink into applications. And I just thought to myself, if one day I want to start something, why not just start working on it now as a side project during my final year, just for the learning. I'm not expecting to make any lists or be Forbes 30 ironically. I didn't go into it expecting or hoping for any of that. I just wanted to learn, just wanted to see what would come of it, but I really didn't expect it to go anywhere.
What would you say was a key lesson that you learned immediately? Like what was the first thing that kind of hit you when you made that step?
I think it was that nobody is telling me what to do, and I actually loved that. I think for somebody like myself, I had always felt slightly stifled in larger organizations where there was a lot of red tape and I wasn't given the kind of responsibility that I wanted. What I loved about starting my own company was it was, as not to trivialize it, and it's extremely difficult, but to get started, it's on me. Like, I have to choose to do this. There's no one that's going to tell me to take that first step, to decide that I want to do this, to build a landing page, to do a user interview, to start writing that first line of code. It's completely on you. And I think that's both the best part and the worst part of the job. It's such a huge amount of responsibility and a huge amount of challenges. But I think, again, I've always kind of had that mindset that I've been given every tool possible, by my parents, through my upbringing, to at least try and succeed and do something. So I think and the other side of that is also the degree I did was extremely challenging. To put it quite frankly, it was hard. But the great thing about a physics degree is it teaches you to solve problems and hard problems. And so I think I've always had this almost default level expectation that I'm going to run into challenges. They're going to be hard. But I have that inner self-belief that I can just solve them and I can get over it. And so I think that was just the biggest learning, that like, wow, there's so much freedom. Nobody is telling me what to do, so I can do everything. I can move at the pace I want to, and I don't need to be confined by any, social barriers or anything like that.
I really resonate with that. I mean, when I look at my own journey, I'm a fintech entrepreneur, don't come from a technology background, but I could see where the challenges were, the problems I wanted to solve, and how technology could play a part. And going into one of the most competitive industries in the world, arguably, and navigating through to where we are and where we're going. I'm really proud of that journey, but it also meant that it shaped my character as a person, and it shaped my view of how I see the world. I came into this space not with a chip on my shoulder, but a point to prove to myself to a degree, I suppose, in that I can go into a place where there's not much people that look like me, sound like me, in an area that I haven't studied for, I haven't learnt about in that sense. But it's that conviction of purpose. And it strikes me that with your journey, and forget about privilege or opportunity, you had a very, very clear purpose, and you were unwavering about going through the fire to achieve that purpose. But what would you say changed you in terms of how you were to where you are now and where you're going to be? What changed you? What made that step change for you to be the person that you are at present?
So I'm going to tell you a story about when I was 1 year old, and the point of this story is to illustrate that I don't think I've really changed at all. So in our Indian culture, there is a ceremony that you do with a baby, a toddler, where you have this tray, and on this tray I think you have a book, you have some money, you have like a religious token, you have all these different items, and you present it to the baby, and they are meant to pick something. And it's a nice family thing, but it's also sometimes seen as an indication of what this person leans towards, or what they might be in the future. And there's a really funny picture of my granddad holding this tray in front of me, and me grabbing everything on the tray.
Yeah, that kind of says it all.
and the thing is, of course my opinions have changed as I've learned new information, and my perspectives have changed, but I think who I am at my core has not really changed. I have been shaped by big life experiences, and I think that the biggest one was my international upbringing, for the reason I mentioned earlier, because it gave me a tremendous sense of perspective. And then there was kind of the self-awareness that I built through all of those different career related adventures, shall we call them. But I think deep down, I've always been a very resilient person. And I don't know whether this was because of the hobbies I had as a child. I was a gymnast, I had a lot of training. So I'd always been very disciplined, very resilient. I've always expected challenges. But I think, the way that I was raised, the way my parents raised me, I credit them largely. I've always been confident. I've always been told to speak up. When I was a child, at dinner parties, there was never a kids' table and an adults' table. I was encouraged as a child, talk to the adults. So I never had any fear of I'm young or inexperienced. I have my own experiences. And actually, for my age, I have a lot of experiences. And that should be heard. I deserve to be heard. So I think, having had this reinforcement throughout my childhood, throughout my life, is what has contributed to who I am today. And as I said, what has changed on my specific opinions on certain things, for example, being a female founder. As I said, when I first started my founder journey, I really didn't even think about that. When I went through my first fundraising experience, it turned my opinion on that on its head. Of actually, it's a completely different experience, and there are legitimate barriers in place. But the way that I still approach my founder journey and my life more broadly has actually always been kind of the same, which is, just be clear on what my values are, know right from wrong, and give everything I do 100%. Don't obsess too much about the outcomes, just focus on what's within my control. And I think it's just more been a case of jumping at opportunities as and when they've come up and applying that same mindset to many different circumstances.
I think that's commendable, and I think, having the foundation to be able to build upon that approach and that mentality and those principles to drive you forward is absolutely amazing. But what would you say to those who may have not ever thought about themselves in that way, who may have had this sense of ambition or sense of aspiration about what they wanted to achieve, but didn't really think they could make it? What would you say to, I guess, that individual? And as a subset to that question, have there been times where the way that you have been has actually had the reversed impact, and it's been a negative experience because you might have been too driven or too focused? So what would you say to the person who hasn't had that opportunity to think in that way? And is there any opportunity or examples of when you have been like that and it's had the negative effect?
Yeah, well, I can answer the second question first, because there's a very recent and timely example where, the personality and mindset that I have, I'm grateful for 99.9% of the time, because it leads to a very happy day to day, because, I focus on my values, living true to them. And for me, those top three are very clear. The most important thing in my life is my family, my closest relationships is number one. The second thing is my health, and the third is my work and what I'm achieving through that. So long as every day I've, called my mum, I've gone to the gym, and I have had a good day at work, I'm happy. So most of the time I'm really happy. I recently ran my first half marathon race. And, I'm not an athlete by any means. I only got into running last year, and the improvement I have made is crazy. I'm so proud of how much my running has improved. Now, I spontaneously signed up for a race about 2 months ago. And I remember telling my coach at the time that I want to aim for 1 hour 50. And in my head and my heart, I knew anything less than 2 hours as someone that's never run this distance before is really good, especially someone starting where I was starting. But I said, okay, is it too ambitious to go for 1 hour 50? He said, no, I think we can do it. I trained incredibly hard for this. And even though, first the initial goal was less than 2 hours, then it was 1 hour 50. And then by the end of the training, some of my paces suggested maybe I could get 1 hour 45. On the day, I achieved 1 hour 48. And all of my family, everyone who didn't know me super well was really congratulating me. My family, my partner, they could tell I was not happy with it. And, me even 2 months ago could not have held that 5 minute, 8 second pace for even 1 kilometer, and I held it for 21 kilometers. You know, my fitness has improved leaps and bounds, and that's the whole reason I started running in the first place, as a fun thing, as, you know, something to improve my fitness. But, you know, where I think because in my work I've dealt with so many challenges, and I've learned to really not associate my happiness with milestones. As I said, I'm not an athlete, so this was kind of a new, completely different challenge, totally decoupled from any work success, and I just hadn't had the experience. And so I am an ambitious person. I set this goal, the goalpost kept on and on moving, and it was interesting because I know this so well from my work, to not obsess over targets and goals and just give it my best every day. But I suppose I've had so many opportunities to fail in my work, and I have failed, but I've kept picking myself up, you know, gone for the next challenge. Whereas in my, you know, short-lived sporting career, that hasn't quite happened yet. And so it really affected my mindset. I was really disappointed, or not disappointed, but just underwhelmed. And I finished that race just thinking, like, is that it? Like, what now? You know? And the first thing I thought of was I have another half marathon in October, and I'm going to get the 1:45. But I didn't pause to celebrate. I didn't feel any sense of pride, even though I'm objectively proud. I'm objectively happy with the time. I didn't feel that happiness. And this was reminiscent of a lot of moments, even in my founder journey, to be fair. You know, when I closed my funding round, I was 22 years old. I raised almost $1 million. It's a huge achievement. I say that now, 3 years in hindsight, like, wow, that is so impressive. If I saw another 22-year-old in that position, I would be in awe. But I never felt that same sense of pride when I had that achievement, or any accolade, or any, you know, key contract that we've won. I've never felt an overwhelming sense of pride, even though I know how hard I've worked for every single achievement, because I'm always focused on the next goal, and, you know, and I know that the goalpost keeps moving. So I'd say that in some senses, that's the downside of having this mindset and this level of ambition, is that sometimes if you hyperfixate on these targets, you are setting yourself up for a life of unhappiness, because by definition the goalpost is always going to keep moving. But, you know, it's something that I've definitely got a much better hold on through my work, and it's been 2 weeks since my race, and I'm over it, and I'm slowly getting back into training.
I don't think you're over it. I don't think you're over it.
Yeah, we'll see.
No, I think there's nothing wrong with having that high achiever standard and mindset. In fact, that's the prerequisite for any successful entrepreneur, is to have that sense of drive and sense of achievement. But it's also having, as you quite rightly said, the recognition that at times it could be quite damaging and quite limiting, and it's how you deal with that. Because quite often as entrepreneurs we have this, because we've set up our lives and our businesses to solve a problem. Whatever that problem is, as far as we're concerned, it's solved. It's just a matter of time for that to manifest in reality. It's already solved, otherwise we wouldn't even start this journey in the first place. And arguably you have to be borderline insane to even get on this journey in the first place. That being said, the level of risk and reward, the margin is very thin. And we often operate on that kind of thin line, right? And in fact, arguably we like being on that thin line, because that's what drives that sense of purpose, but also the opportunity for what the next level look like. One of my mentors once said to me, I remember, that we were talking about diversity and inclusion, and I want to kind of come to that in a moment, but particularly in the tech space. And, you know, everyone's talking about there's a glass ceiling, and both, you know, particularly for women, but, you know, there's a glass ceiling for anyone who's got any kind of diversity characteristic of any description. And I was saying, you know, I want to get there, but I'm not. What's the point even trying when I get there? And the gentleman turned around and said to me, and it's something that I'll never forget. He said to me, "There's no such thing as a glass ceiling. It's just the level of the floor above." And so it's the floor of the level above. And it was like a light bulb moment when he said that to me, because it made me realise that people will look at that same floor above and see it as a ceiling because that's how they see it. What really matters is how you see any challenge, and how you decide to turn that challenge into an opportunity, or an opportunity to stop you challenging. And yes, there are some external things that you can't always control, but what you can control is your response to those challenges.
Absolutely.
And it strikes me that having that kind of high achiever mindset is about controlling that response. But likewise, as I said in my earlier question, what happens when the person may not feel they've even got the basic foundation of the tools, the elements, the mindset to even start the challenge?
Yeah, and I think it's a tough one, because the thing I will always advocate for first and foremost is you have to be yourself, number one. And I don't believe in the like fake it till you make it mindset or mentality. I think that if you're living as somebody else, it doesn't work for me. I don't subscribe to that mindset. I think it's just all about reflection and actually realizing that, again, I don't want to get too philosophical here, but we all have some element of free will in our lives. We make our own choices for ourselves, as long as we're not, in prison, we choose what time we wake up, what time we eat, what we do for work, the relationships that we nurture, all of this. And I think realizing that you are both responsible, but not in a heavy way, but actually you have the freedom to craft the life that you want, can be an incredibly liberating thought and motivating factor. I think a lot of people are really influenced by outside factors, or what they feel is expected of them, or what everyone else is doing. But if you pause for a second and you actually use sort of a first principles thinking approach of, I'm here on this planet, I am an adult, I get to live my life the way that I want, then you realize that the decisions you make are all choices. There is no default correct thing to do or incorrect thing to do. And if you are somebody like me that happens to be highly ambitious, driven, has these big dreams and wants to achieve them, I remember that that's a choice. And actually in my hardest moments, that's what I remind myself that, I've heard 10 no's from investors today. I put myself in front of them, right? There is a universe in which I didn't have to start a company. I could be coasting along in my life, living an easier life, but I actually chose this route. Would I make the same decision? Yes or no? And the answer is always yes. I would 100% choose this path, even though it's hard. And so I think to somebody that is perhaps not as driven, firstly, I don't think that's a bad thing. Everyone wants different things out of life. And I think it's really important to have a strong sense of self-awareness of what is truly important to you. I don't think everyone should be an entrepreneur. I don't think this job is for everyone. I don't think this mentality suits everyone. And there is absolutely nothing wrong with that. There are many ways to have an impact in the world, and entrepreneurship is not the only one. So I think it's understanding about yourself, what matters to you, what does success look like to you, and what does happiness look like to you. And as I described, for me, I have these three factors: close relationships, health, and impact through my work. And because impact through my work is one of the most important things to me and a driver of my happiness and success, I prioritize it. That's not the case for some people, and that's actually completely fine. Not everyone has to be chasing work goals or even impact. Do whatever makes you happy to an extent. If you feel like you are inspired by people who are achieving things, but for whatever reason you don't have or you feel that you don't have the drive, I think then again it's all about just reflecting and trying to ask why. Is it because you've tried really hard in the past and you haven't seen the results? Is it that you feel no one around you is trying these things, so you feel like an outlier? And perhaps actually just trying to rationalize why you're not achieving what you want to achieve can help you approach it in a more problem-solving approach of, okay, well, maybe this is an actual challenge, or maybe I actually don't have the financial freedom to just start a business. A lot of entrepreneurs who have started companies, they have financial backing, right? That's something that it doesn't get talked about a lot. I had to find that for myself. I never beat myself up when I was a uni student that I wasn't yet an entrepreneur, because I knew that I had to secure external capital, which was a legitimate added challenge to my founder journey, and I'm really proud that I achieved it. But also, it was a very rational way of approaching the problem of, I believe I can be an entrepreneur. The thing I don't have is money. I am not going to beat myself up about not having this. So, I think, that's what I'd boil it down into, is build up a sense of self-awareness, understand what your own values are, And if after that you still feel that you want to be bold and ambitious, but for whatever reason you're not feeling that in your day to day, just try and break it down. Try and just really remember that you have the freedom to choose, that you do choose how you spend your 24 hours in a day, and almost do an audit of, am I spending them in the way that's getting me closer to those goals or not?
Yeah, I love that rationalization of it, and I think it's so important. One of the things I always remind myself of and live my life myself by actually is, never forget where you come from, because that makes you who you are, but never forget where you're going, because that's who you're going to become. And it's what grounds me, when I come home, and as long as my wife's happy, my children are happy, I'm good. When it sounds, I know, we're not going to get all kumbaya and sit around a campfire and talk all philosophical about it, but the reality is that when that time comes where we're no longer here, none of this will make a difference. What does make a difference is the feeling, the legacy, how your life impacted others who are going to follow on after you. Mm-hmm. And often it's those who are most important to you who are going to be the first people who are going to take on board that impact. And so you have to make sure that those who are most important to you in your life are part of your journey, but that your journey also sets up positivity in their own lives. If nothing else, giving them the permission to be able to take on board the lessons that they've learned from you and do it in their own way. And so when I see people or when I talk to people who say, oh, I can't do this, that and the other, I'm like, well, why? And because it's somebody else, I always ask them, well, what's your responsibility within that? What's the choice that you can make? And like I said, it is not easy, and it is not always in your control, but your response and your choice to how you choose to do something always is. Mm-hmm. And being driven to achieve X doesn't mean you're better or lower than anybody else. It just means that your journey is different. And on that, what kind of leads me to is I guess the sense of the role of your diversity and inclusion. How has that played a part in your journey, both personally and professionally?
Yeah, so I think I touched on this briefly earlier, that when I started my founder journey in the early years of my career while I was at university doing internships, I never even really thought about what it meant to be young, a person of color, and a woman. And I think that's because, again, I touched on this earlier, when you're in education, things are fairly standard. I mean, I was aware that on my physics degree, there were maybe 20% women, 80% men. And I thought a little bit about that, about, why is it so imbalanced? But as far as, I am here now, am I being treated differently? No, not really. I never felt that my results or my grading was in any way correlated with my gender or, diversity factors. So, I was quite shielded to it. And when I started my company, I still held this approach. If anything, it went the other way, that I thought, well, a big part of my job is doing user interviews. Is somebody, a young girl with acne, more likely to talk to me about their skin challenges, or your traditional, image of what a software engineer looks like? Oh, sorry, have I frozen? Can you hear me?
Yep, still there. You were still there.
Okay. It cut out for me a little bit, but as I was saying, I actually viewed the fact that I was a young brown woman as a huge advantage in building the kind of business that I am, given that it's in the skincare space. I felt that was an advantage. And, even on the young point, I remember my first day at YC, one of my batchmates, I was complaining about some of the challenges I was having, which I will get to, and there are many challenges. But I was saying that I don't have any connections, I don't have all these pre-existing relationships, what investors am I meant to reach out to? I don't have any in my network. And he was like, all that is true and valid. But the one thing that you have that I don't is you actually have more hours in the day than I do. I have a wife, I have kids, I have other responsibilities. You at this stage of life, I'm not saying it's a healthy or right thing to do, but if you want to, you can outwork me. You have more hours in the day available to you. And I think hearing that, again, it was almost like a privilege reminder of, that's so true. I am so fortunate. I don't have any caring responsibilities. I can actually outwork someone that does, and I should use that to my advantage. And I absolutely did, which is why I worked crazy hours for the first few years of my career. And again, there's a balance there, and now I found a much healthier balance. But the point is, I always felt that who I am was an advantage when it came to building my business. The first part of my journey where I felt that it was a hindrance was raising capital. Now, when I did my first funding round, as I alluded to earlier, I was 22 years old. I raised around $1 million US. At that point, I had no investor connections in my network. My funding round felt not too far short of begging and pleading. I did over 200 pitches in about a 3-month time period. And the way I even got those meetings was, every call I finished with a founder or investor, I'd send out hundreds of messages on LinkedIn. The one person that would say yes, I would just shamelessly ask them, like, which investors do you know? Like, I'll forward you my blurb. I'll make it really easy for you to send on. Anyone in your network you can introduce me to. Because what I realized very quickly is most investors don't take cold outreach. You have to know somebody to talk to them, which makes it harder for somebody like me who is outside of these circles to break in the first place. So, it was really, really hard. And I got to the end of my funding round, and I just sort of thought to myself, I was just thinking about all my investors one day, like, oh, is it just me, or like most of my investors women? And just as almost like a thought experiment, as an exercise, I had my list of, all the meetings I'd done, who they were with, and I just added a column for gender, just out of curiosity. And it turned out that of all the meetings I did, those 200 pitches, about 75% were with male investors, which is roughly expected. There's more male investors than there are female investors. In terms of the number of investors on my cap table, so those that actually invested, over 80% were women. And if you look at the dollars invested, so you now account for the check sizes, how much money they gave me, over 90% of the dollars I've raised have come from female investors. Now, I know enough about data to know that, 200 isn't that small. That's a statistically significant sample size. Something is going on here. And, after that, I did a little bit of a deep dive, and ironically with some of my amazing male investors who've been in the space a lot longer than I have, to understand and just rationalize and make sense of these numbers. Because had I actually had this insight before my funding round, I would have actually strategized differently. I would have prioritized female investors, because my success rate is orders of magnitude higher. And the more that I learned, I broke it down into understanding, firstly, conscious biases, unconscious biases, which I think is the large majority of what makes it harder for people like me. I have now had enough encounters with people over the last 4-ish years of building my business where people have told me, you don't look like someone with a physics degree. People have said, oh, like, who's conducting this technical interview? Where is the software engineer? I've had investors not believe that I wrote the code for my app, crazy things like this, where I've had to show the GitHub commits and show, this, it's me that has
have to prove yourself or something that,
Yeah, and so it's crazy. I've had so many encounters now to know that it is not the same experience being a female founder versus a male founder. Live pitch events, the way women are questioned versus how men are questioned. I firmly believe that it's a completely different experience, and the numbers reflect that. Well, the year that I raised funding, it was about 2% of venture capital went to female founders. It's gone down since. It's getting worse. So, the stats are really dire. I was naive to them when I started raising, and as soon as I learned about them after my round, I was not surprised in the least, because it was entirely representative of the experience that I had. And so, I think there are a lot of challenges, but as I said a second ago, it comes down to unconscious biases, it comes down to pattern matching. And in a way, the only thing that you can do to break that is to, number one, acknowledge it. So when somebody told me, you don't look like someone with a physics degree, I responded, I said, so tell me, what does somebody with a physics degree look like? And it just makes them question, and the thing is, you don't want to alienate the person on the other side, because 9 out of 10 times, it's coming from a place of sheer ignorance. It's not out of malice. It's not to actively discriminate. It's just they have not been in a position like this before. So in a way, not that it's my responsibility, but it's I have the floor. I have the opportunity. I'm in this meeting. I can educate them, so I will. And I will make them think, then what does somebody with a physics degree look like to you? So that the next time they see a young brown woman they don't assume that she cannot possibly be technical or couldn't possibly be the one that
100%.
wrote the code for her company.
That is absolutely spot on. What you say resonates so much. It's ironic. When I was raising investment for my business, it was actually a female investor invested into my business, and more men said no, and that was quite interesting. And that person has been a fantastic mentor for me in my business. So I completely concur with that, albeit the other way around. But also as well, the unconscious bias piece. You reminded me of in a former life, I was the diversity officer for golf in the UK. So I was responsible for creating a diversity and inclusion strategy for the sport, and I was 30 years old. Many moons ago now. I'm not as young as I look, I suppose.
Well, the skincare routine was working well, Joel.
all down to my wife and taking care of me, I'm sure. I was the diversity officer, and I had to travel around the country going to all these different golf clubs, talking about why it's important for them to think differently, how to get more female golfers, different minority golfers with disabilities, and all diversity characteristics into golf clubs. And cutting a long story short, I remember going to one golf club, and if you can imagine the scene of a old panelled golf club room, pictures on the wall of every single club captain from 19 God knows when, the suits, blazers, whole shebang. And I got to the meeting early, setting up the room to do this kind of diversity training meeting with the club captain and the board and all of this. People started coming in, bit by bit. Eventually there's about 12 people in the room, and every person that came in would look at me and then go and sit down. Look at me, go and sit down. I go, okay. So I'm here going, okay, here we go. One point someone said, yeah, I'll have a coffee and something, please. Must have thinking I was there to serve the tea. Now, what was very interesting about that particular incident is that my name is Joel Lloyd Graham Blake, and for a period of my time, people thought Graham Blake was my name double-barreled. So at that point, they knew this Joel Graham Blake was coming into this meeting, so they're assuming whoever this Joel Graham Blake is wasn't me. So I'm in the room, everyone's seated, so I start, hi, I'm Joel Graham Blake. Oh, okay. People's eyes turn again, etc., etc. And I realised that, okay, this is going to be a hard task teaching diversity and inclusion training to this group of individuals. And I'm talking, they look like the pictures. There was one woman in the room, pearl necklace, earrings, like not being, stereotypical here, but that's what she looked like. And it was like, okay, this is going to be interesting. Within 20 minutes, I realised that I couldn't deliver the training. It wasn't going to work. But what I did know is that there was a hook, and the hook was the fact that it was about money. Their club membership was dying, and so if they didn't engage diversely, they weren't going to have members, and I knew that would be the trigger to get them engaged in the subject matter. So I started talking about the money. And obviously I'd done my research, I'd brought my figures and my stats, and we talked about that. Once I used that hook, we got involved in a conversation. That then opened them up to learning more about who I was and what I was coming to talk about, and therefore when I started talking, putting in a language that they understood, it opened up them in terms of who they were and why golf was so important to them. Then it started to open up the conversation about having a deeper understanding about people, then a deeper understanding about their community around them, deeper understanding again about the opportunity, and then the diversity training began to come out through that conversation. By the end of that training, I'd found out that somebody had a holiday home in Barbados and they'd been going there for 40 years. Someone was actually married to a woman of colour. Somebody wanted my nan's jerk chicken recipe. Another had gone to Bob Marley's concert when he came to London. Like, it was just a completely different room. And I realised that I'd come into that room with a bit of a perception. As the someone with the diversity characteristic, I'd come in with my own perception, and I was wrong, because I was judging the room even before the room had started to judge me. And what that taught me is that people are people, and they will come from whatever they're coming from, and they bring whatever they would bring into the room. Where it becomes discriminatory, that's where there is a problem. Where there is a conscious choice to use difference against an individual for a negative reason, that's a problem.
Yeah.
But sometimes people have a genuine ignorance because that's how they've grown. Because I learned that, you know, X, Y, and Z's father had been a member of the same golf club. Their father had been a member of the golf club. Their great granddad, or probably granddad in that context, was actually on the wall in the room. So you realise, and then, you know, their family network is part of that golf culture and so forth and so forth. So you're absolutely right. Sometimes people come with their biases that they may not be aware of, but that's all they know. Our job is to be much more educative about supporting the knowledge transfer, because we all learn something in that interaction.
Yeah,
and I think that's such an empowering thing.
So true. I think it's just about having empathy, and in the same way that I would expect respect and empathy, it's treating the other person you're talking to the same way. And again, in a way, it was a privilege for me to have, for example, had those international experiences as a teenager. You know, that taught me a lot about many different cultures. It taught me some cultures are more hierarchical, some are more formal, some are more easygoing, and it's fine to hug them, you know, and some you take your shoes off when you go to the house. You learn all these things, and you understand why the cultures have formed and why people think the way that they do. But again, using the P word, privilege, it comes from a place of privilege of having had the opportunity to meet people from all around the world as a teenager. How many people have that opportunity? And that I'm just talking in my specific case. In the same way, when somebody acts or behaves ignorant or says something ignorant, most of the time, it isn't to discriminate. I think, you know, the definition of discrimination you used was spot on. It's just coming from a place of ignorance, and it's actually they haven't had the opportunity to have been educated on this, and rather than alienate or antagonize, it's actually it's an amazing opportunity to build the empathy, to create the understanding, in the same way that, you know, you and I hold our own biases, and just because we are both people of color doesn't mean we don't still have things to learn. There are certain privileges that you and I have that others don't have. So you know, I think it's all about just being open-minded, approaching people and conversations with empathy, and not assuming the worst, even in spite of bad circumstances. And there are racists out there.
Let's not sugarcoat it. There are challenges, and there always will be. But I think you're absolutely right. It's having that sense of empathy, but also not devaluing yourself because you're in that situation where you're feeling oppressed either. And I know that's not easy. And I've still struggled with that relatively recently, actually, around okay, how am I coming across? You know, is it true what they're saying? You know, you question yourself. But you mentioned it earlier. It's this sense of reflection and understanding your journey to the point where this person has this interaction with you. It is a privilege to be even in that situation where you have an opportunity to both learn and to teach in that same interaction. And there's learning for everyone in that process. And, you know, what you've shown just in this conversation is a real level of self-awareness and acknowledgement of the responsibility of leading change, but starting it from within. You know, not many people are as self-aware to really understand the importance of that, particularly as an entrepreneur, and particularly as someone who's got a very, very clear mission and a very clear, and is driven towards achieving that. And I think many entrepreneurs could learn from that sense of authenticity, regardless of what they have or don't have, in order to achieve the thing that they are going to achieve. Not what they want to, but are going to, because they've already made that commitment internally to do so. And I guess in closing, you know, we've talked a lot about that personal journey. What's next for you? First and foremost, I like to ask, and then I maybe like to ask you just to maybe share a closing thought for the audience.
Yeah, well, what's next for me is after this, I'm getting back into the code base. So we're actually launching a premium tier of our app. We have quite an exciting new feature set. It's kind of a big milestone as far as the overall company business journey. But a lot of people don't realize the Clear team is still just two of us full time. And although I now do things like podcasts, I still spend as much time writing code and doing all of the much less glamorous work. But no, so that's currently happening. We're also planning to ramp things up on the marketing front. For a long time, the whole focus of myself and our CTO was just on the product and on the tech. We both come from physics backgrounds, and to have the kind of impact that I envision in the industry, that starts with a great product that really helps people. And so, what that meant in terms of my day-to-day for the first 3.5 years of my company was every day writing code, talking to users, looking at the metrics. And so it's nice to now be at the stage where a lot of that hard work's paying off. Apple actually just featured us as App of the Day, which was another big recent milestone. And we've spent nothing on acquiring users. It's all been completely organic. All of the recognition we've had is organic. We don't do PR or anything like that. And so it's nice now to start to be at the point where we have that solid foundation, and it's now about thinking, how do we make this bigger and actually deliver on that initial vision that I'd set out in terms of the scale. Because in terms of what we're doing, we're already there, and I feel so excited and fulfilled by that. And now it's just a matter of scaling it up. So stay tuned for some more marketing and more about Clear generally. I'm really, really excited about that. And I think just as a closing thought, and perhaps leading off of that, I'm sure as we have this upcoming launch, as we continue to grow the company, there will be more challenges. That's something I'm guaranteed of, that there will be challenges. But I think the most important thing that I was going to say any entrepreneur needs, but honestly, any ambitious person needs is resilience. With any person that has achieved any kind of success, they have also experienced an overwhelming amount of failure, and frankly, more failure than most people would be willing to deal with. And that is the secret behind success. And so I think, coming back to the point of those of us who are very ambitious and we have big dreams and goals and a vision for the world that we want to bring into reality, that's hard. And so if you're on that journey and you're finding it hard, whether that's getting meetings with investors, closing the investment, launching a product, getting to product market fit, it's not because you're bad at it, it's because it's hard. It's testament to the fact that it's actually challenging. And the thing that separates people who end up achieving the success that they envision versus those that don't, it's just a game of resilience. And, I think you should almost expect failure. You should expect rejection on your journey. And I'm not saying throw a party every time you get bad news. Of course, it will always sting. It will never feel nice. But try and maintain the perspective that if you're experiencing tough times, it's testament to the fact that what you're doing is hard. And again, it's a conscious choice. You are the one with the dreams. You are the one that chose to try and deliver on them. You don't have to, right? There are futures in which you could choose an easier path, but you wanted to do this. And this is a sign that you're actually on that path of growth, of impact. So don't let the hard times get you down. They will never be fun. But when you try and zoom out for a second, just remember that it's all part of the bigger success story in the end.
That's fantastic, and you're absolutely right. Resilience is the key. There are many journeys, many battles, many challenges ahead, but everything has a lesson and a blessing for you to take from it. And it's just being open and driven towards those goals, and accepting that these challenges are those learning points that will drive you forward. And indeed, your success is actually in your disadvantage. Whether that's a perceived disadvantage or a disadvantage in the challenges because you've come against something that is forcing you to accept that you might not have the learning that you need at the moment, but it doesn't mean you can't get it to move ahead. So resilience is key, and the ability to take action on that resilience is important. I guess finally, what would people gain from contacting you on OpenIntro? What is it that people should be contacting you for?
Yeah, well, I've been through basically every stage of the founder journey, from how does one even get there, starting a company as a young person, as a student, without any family connections, through to the technical side, actually choosing the frameworks, writing the code, all of the product development, how to do user interviews, how to analyze the data, the metrics, how to use that to inform your product decisions and roadmap, all the way through to marketing. I started TikTok about a year ago. I've since had over 50 viral videos, over 3 million views. And again, that's been zero budget, just me with this old iPhone 12 mini plodding along every day. So, the marketing side, B2B sales, the way we monetize is through providing brands with a service similar to clinical trials, but they test their products with our community. So, I've gone through the whole B2B sales process. Of course, fundraising, how do you structure a pitch? How do you talk to investors? How do you reach them in the first place? And even, more internal facing things like team culture, that's something I've been very mindful of. And although our core team is small, we've had times where we've had over 30 people on the team in part-time capacities. And I'm very conscious about the culture that's built at Clear, and it's something that I'm actually very, very proud of as well, not just what we're doing, but how we're doing things. So I think, when you're a founder, you do everything. I have done everything. And, I think I can never guarantee that my advice will be, the answer to all of your questions, because I don't think that's what a conversation or mentorship should be. But what I do hope is that, especially through this conversation, anyone listening understands who I am and why I think the way that I do. And based off of that, any advice I give is from these experiences that I have had in my life, and I can advise to the best of my abilities. And the one thing that I can promise is I will be open, honest, and transparent, which, hopefully you've seen from everything I've shared in the past hour or so. And I think more than anything, I just want to see positive in this world. I want to see people who are ambitious, driven, talented, using their skills to do something good. And so if you are doing all of those things, I can commit to doing my very best to helping you.
That's fantastic. Oh, look, I want to thank you very much for your time. I know you're incredibly busy, and as you say, I know you're going to jump off this call and straight back to the coding. So, but look, this is the reality of the journey, and wish you every single success. We thank you for being part of the OpenIntro community, and I'm sure people will be contacting you to learn a lot more about you, both here and offline, in terms of who you are, what you do, and how they can help you to continue to make a positive impact in the world. So thank you much for your time.
Thank you, Joel. It was a pleasure to chat with you today.
You take care now. Bye-bye.
Bye.